massacre, the lives lost.
I sent her to school yesterday. She was supposed to be safe.
And what led a troubled teen to buy a semi-automatic rifle and use it to kill. We'll discuss the latest mass shooting and how to prevent more with Rush Limbaugh, who joins us live for a rare television interview. And we'll talk about where this leaves the debate over gun control with Mark Kelly, the retired astronaut husband of Gabby Giffords and a leader in preventing gun violence. Plus, we'll hear from a group of survivors who want to rally young people across the country and force action to stop the bloodshed.
Politicians can make all the promises they want, and they can give all their condolences. But at what point do we say that's not enough, and we call for action?
Then,
the indictment alleges that the Russian conspirators want to promote discord in the United States and undermine public confidence in democracy.
We'll ask our Sunday panel about a sweeping indictment presenting new evidence of how Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election. All right now on Fox News Sunday. And hello again from Fox News in Washington. We are still feeling the shockwaves from yet another school shooting. The massacre at a Florida high school has reignited the debate over guns and mental health. And there are troubling questions about the FBI's failure to follow up on warnings about the shooter. In a few minutes, we'll discuss all this with Rush Limbaugh and gun control advocate Mark Kelly. But we begin with breaking news. Students from the high school are making an announcement today. 5 of them have joined us. And guys, I want you to know how sorry we are for what you went through and for the loss of your friends. Cameron, what's your announcement today?
Today, I'd like to announce that we have an event coming up to have everybody in the nation talking about what we're talking about. And one of the things we've been hearing is that it's not the time yet to talk about gun control. And we respect that. We've lost 17 lives, and our community took 17 bullets to the heart. And it's difficult to come back from that. So here's the time that we're going to talk about gun control. March 24th, we have the March for Our Lives, which you can find at marchforourlives.com, and expect to see us a lot. The March for Our Lives is going to be in every major city, and we are organizing it so students everywhere can beg for our lives. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about the red and blue, the GOP and the Democrats. This is about adults and kids. And at this point, you're either with us or against us. We are giving all our politicians a clean slate, and in the next election, we are saying, if you are accepting money from the NRA, there is a badge of shame on you, because you are enabling things like this to happen.
David, do you have a specific agenda on how you think you can protect kids? Are these marches going to be mostly politicians talking to the crowds, or is this going to be students trying to mobilize other students?
This is a student-led grassroots movement, and this is not a debate. This is a discussion between Americans, because we've had too many debates before, and we've gotten nowhere. We need a discussion where we hear both sides. From the Republicans, they can talk about mental health care, and from the Democrats, they can talk about gun control. But what we need to do here is come together, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans, and work together to solve this issue through love and compassion, because this event occurred on Valentine's Day, sadly, and sadly, 17 people had to take a bullet to the heart, and so did our community. This is the time for change, and we can't let this ever happen again.
Well, let me pick up on that, because as terrible, and you know, I can't even imagine what you kids went through, as terrible as what happened at your school, I don't have to tell you, there have been other schools, Sandy Hook and Columbine and so many others. And, you know, the nation mourns. We are all very upset. And then we move on and nothing much happens. David, what makes you think this time is going to be any different?
I think this time's different because immediately, the same day as the shooting, I immediately went on Fox News, in fact, and talked about how this needed to be different, how this could not be just another mass shooting. We've had 18 this year since New Year's Eve, and now is the time for discussion. It's not time for debate. It's time to work together. Our elected officials need to get together, overcome their political differences, and get some things done, because they need to save the future of our country. And the future of our country are those children that are currently dying because politicians refuse to take action. and continue to take money from these special interest groups.
Finally, Emma, take us back to the shooting. How terrifying was it? And is this call for a national march on March 24th, is this an effort to give some meaning to the senseless murder of some of your classmates?
This is a case of simple, please stop. Please stop allowing us to be gunned down in our hallways. People are telling us that we should run for president. We want an education, you know? Like, at this point, we're trying so desperately hard to communicate what we're feeling, and so many people are listening to us. You know, the older generations are, every generation is supporting us with countless amounts of energy. So many people are coming up to us on the street saying thank you. And we want to thank them by communicating what we're trying to communicate. We want to get the support for March for Our Lives, the website that's going up today, that is up currently. We want students to be at that march and to be with us. We want to be with those students who we didn't understand their pain before, and it's all too tragic that we all have to understand the same pain now.
We're here for everybody's kids.
Guys, thank you. Thanks for joining us today, and I want to invite any of you who come to the march here in Washington next month to come back on this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Now, let's bring in the king of conservative talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, live from his EIB studio in Florida. Rush, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here with you.
What do you think of this idea of students mobilizing across the country, a march on Washington, march in communities, students trying to get politicians to act?
What I found interesting about the students, and they're very articulate, and you have to feel for them. And, I mean, it's wrecked their lives. They are a combination scared and angry. But, Chris, I have to ask if anybody's really serious about solving this, because none of this, and by the way, I couldn't care less about the gun angle of this. None of this is going to solve it. Prayers and condolences don't solve it, and marches aren't going to solve it. Chris, the next shooter is out there. The next shooter probably has the gun that he's going to use. The next shooter is known by many people in his community who are concerned that this guy may do what everybody's afraid he's going to do. Now, how is anything that we're talking about going to stop that? We have got to realize this is what our country has become. We can wish that it weren't this way, and we can wish that Congress could legislate it away, but they can't. It's not the fault of the NRA. It's not the fault of it's the fault of the people doing this and our inability to deal with that and stop them. We have security, armed security at virtually every public entity in this country except schools. For some reason, they are a gun-free zone, and everybody who wants to shoot up a school knows that they're going to be the only one armed. And until we're really to get serious about where we are and how do we stop this from happening, and marches aren't going to do it, saying no more guns isn't going to do it, bashing the NRA isn't going to do it.
Let me ask you about one. Let me ask you about one aspect of this, though, because we have now learned of two cases where the FBI failed to follow up on credible information about the shooter. Yeah. And we've now learned that just last month that someone close to Nicholas Cruz, the shooter, called the FBI tip line, and according to the FBI, said this. He talked about Cruz's gun ownership, desire to kill people, erratic behavior, and disturbing social media posts, as well as the potential of him conducting a school shooting. But that information was never forwarded to the Miami field office. How do you explain that?
Well, I could be snarky, and I could say maybe the FBI should stop trying to find every case of sexual harassment in the White House, and maybe they ought to give up on this ridiculous pursuit the Russians colluded with Trump on the election. But clearly, this is my point. A lot of people knew. A lot of people had every bit of knowledge they knew to act on this guy, to surveil this guy. You know, we're told, well, we can't do anything until the crime's been committed. That's what has to change. And it's going to take some really smart people to figure out how to do that without violating civil liberties and the Fourth Amendment and so forth. But it's clear that the way we deal with this now, Chris, this is totally political. The students think they're taking politics out of this. The minute they bash the NRA, anti-NRA. It's politics. And the point for many of this is an event that advances a political agenda for the American left and the Democrat Party. Bash the NRA.
Let me pick up on something you said, because at one point you just said at the beginning, I could be snarky and I could say, well, maybe the FBI should stop wasting so much time. And you have suggested this in a kind of provocative way on your radio show, that the FBI is spending too much time on the Trump investigation. But in fact, the president tweeted just that last night. I want to put his tweet up. The president said...
I said it Friday.
I know
said it Friday.
Well, maybe he listened to you. Very sad that the FBI missed all of the many signals sent out by the Florida school shooter. This is not acceptable. They are spending too much time trying to prove Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. There is no collusion. Get back to the basics and make us all proud. Do you really see a connection between the FBI investigating the Russia investigation, a potential Trump connection, and the fact that they missed the signals here?
No, that's why I said I could be snarky. But I am trying to make the point. The FBI is engaged in a bunch of stuff that's time wasting, and it isn't going to take us anywhere. And it's all, Chris, everything has become politicized, political in this country, and that's why we can't solve anything. The minute, and I'll tell you who the primary perpetrators are of making it political, is the media. The media carries one side of this argument, the anti-gun, anti-NRA, and they promote anything and anybody that is promoting that and advocating that.
At the risk
once that happens, you can forget about a solution. We're never going to get one because politics enters the scene and corrupts it.
Let me, at the risk of raising your ire and those of your millions of followers, let me ask you a question about guns. To buy a handgun, you have to be 21 years old and undergo a 3-day waiting period. But to buy an AR-15, a semi-automatic rifle, you can be 18 years old and the background check takes just minutes. Question, is that sensible?
It may not be sensible. I don't know. My point is that's not the problem. If you ban the AR-15, they're going to find something. Most of these are handguns anyway. If you ban that, they're going to find some other way to do this. Until we stop them, until we affix blame where it belongs, until we are ready to admit that this is what our country has become. We can't go back to the 50s and Ozzie and Harriet and wish it weren't so.
So what is the one thing?
To the skies, ban the gun.
What is the one single thing? You say identify them. I mean, look, there are a lot of disturbed people out, and the vast majority don't do anything. Nicholas Cruz did do something, and yes, there were warning signs, but how do you identify them?
This guy was identified by everybody that knew him. The FBI knew who he was. The solution to me, and I know this is going to cause all kinds of angst, the solution is we need concealed carry in these schools. If we are really serious about protecting the kids, we need a mechanism to be defensive when this kind of thing. If we're not going to take action to stop it, we better have mechanisms in these schools to stop it when it breaks out. If we don't do that, and all the rest of this is nothing more than political posturing for the 2018 midterms and the 2020 election.
Rush, thank you. You're coming back later in the program to discuss a number of other issues. I'll talk to you in a few minutes. But first, let's turn to Mark Kelly, the retired astronaut who became a leader in preventing gun violence after his wife, former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, was severely injured by a deranged shooter in 2011. Mark, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
In the wake of yet another tragedy, and unfortunately the only times you and I talk tend to be after these tragedies, how would you stop more school shootings, and what do you think of what Rush just said, the idea of concealed carry? I know it's one of the things you're fighting against.
Well, let me start with at the top of what Rush just discussed with you. He says, first of all, the next shooter's out there, has their firearm, ready to do this. There's nothing we can do to stop it. Well, I would admit that in Florida, law enforcement has very few tools to be able to prevent one of these things from happening, even the FBI. But in some states, we have been instrumental and have successfully passed things called extreme risk protection orders or gun violence restraining orders. The state of California, the state of Washington, Oregon, Indiana already had one in place, Connecticut. Law enforcement can be notified by a family member, or maybe they find out about a situation themselves, and there's a very short and abbreviated process to temporarily take the firearm away from the person that they believe is, you know, having some mental issues and are struggling. So we have already multiple times, probably dozens of times, prevented these things from happening.
Okay,
I mean, you just don't ever know for sure. So that situation that you can't stop it, that's actually not true.
Okay, but one of the other questions is the gun, and I know one of the things that you would like to see is a renewal of the assault weapon ban that was passed in the 1990s, and maybe a limit on the capacity of these high-capacity magazines. But in fact, gun rights groups point out that the vast majority of murders in this country are not committed with assault weapons. They're committed with handguns. I want to put up some statistics on that. According to the FBI, in 2016, murder victims by handguns, over 7,000. All the murders from rifles, shotguns, and other guns, all in the hundreds. So are these assault weapons, the semi-automatic weapons, the AR-15, are they the real problem?
That's 100% correct, what you're saying. Most murders, suicides are committed with handguns, clearly. But when an individual goes into a school or another place with a lot of people with a AR-15 or AR-15-like weapon, he has the ability to kill a lot of people much more quickly. The .223 round that's fired out of an AR-15 moves at over 3,000 feet per second. It tumbles when it hits a body. It is much more effective at killing a lot of people all at once. That's why you see it's often the gun of choice of mass shooters. Should a 19-year-old be able to buy an AR-15, but he can't buy a Bud Light? That probably doesn't make a lot of sense. You say we have come out, for an assault weapons ban. We often don't talk about the hardware. Our organization is focused on keeping guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have them. Felons, people who are, show some form of dangerousness, domestic abusers,
but let me just
terrorists.
say, we've got limited time. The fact is, he went through a background check and he passed it, so none of the alarms went off for him.
That's right.
I want to switch, if I can, though, to one other.
But however, if Florida had one of these extreme risk protection orders, maybe local law enforcement would have had the tools to take that firearm away from him months before this happened.
President Trump spoke to the nation after the school shooting, and here was his focus.
We are committed to working with state and local leaders to help secure our schools and tackle the difficult issue of mental health.
In all of his reactions since the either tweets or statements since the school shooting, he has not once mentioned guns, which raises the question, how much confidence do you have? You heard the students at the beginning that the president and Congress it'll be different this time, that they'll actually take action.
Well, these kids are incredibly articulate, and certain members of Congress are really good at not listening to their constituents. I mean, these reforms are supported typically by 70 to 90% of Americans. And to have high school kids who went through this horrific shooting calling for change should matter. I would hope in our society that would make a difference. This is a very political issue, though. We've got to get people to vote on this issue. I can guarantee you that those kids you had on today are going to vote on this issue probably for the rest of their lives. And they're going to encourage others to do that as well.
And Mark, as I say goodbye, I always, whenever I see you, I want to ask, how is Gabby doing?
She's doing well. She's in a great mood. She's working hard. Obviously, like most Americans, she's devastated by what happened in Parkland, and we're going to continue to work hard to do whatever we can to try to make sure this doesn't happen again. We've got to keep guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have them. We've got 4.4% of the population, 44% of the firearms. If you listen to the National Rifle Association or to Rush Limbaugh, you would think we would live in the safest country in the world with the number of firearms. And I'm a gun owner. I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment. Right. We can't let these dangerous people have such easy access. And people are going to vote on this issue. And I've got to believe it's going to change. It's changing in the states. We've helped pass 200 pieces of legislation, 45 different states.
Our best to Gabby. Mark, thank you. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss the fallout from the Florida massacre. Will Washington do anything to stop more school shootings?
Brought to you by Chevron, finding better ways to do what they do to keep doers doing.
This is a story about doers, wings, and neighbors. When you're creating the energy...
Pass gun safety legislation, then win the election, because people die from this.
This is not the time to jump to some conclusion, not knowing the full facts. We've got a lot of more information we need to know.
House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi and House Speaker Paul Ryan with very different reactions to the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And it's time now for our Sunday group, the head of Heritage Action for America, Michael Needham, Charles Lane of the Washington Post, Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief of the Associated Press, and former Press Secretary to Vice President Pence, Mark Lotter. Julie, as I talked about with the students, I don't want to call them kids, they're far too mature and articulate for that. We've seen the frustration, the anger after previous massacres, whether it's Newtown or Las Vegas or on and on. We all wring our hands, we all call for action, nothing gets done. Is there any realistic reason to think this time will be any different?
I haven't seen any realistic reason to feel like this is going to be different, other than the fact that these students are quite articulate and quite powerful in their messaging, and certainly seem a couple days after this shooting like this is going to be something that they're going to be continuing to push. But I mean, I remember these days after Newtown in Washington. It was as rattled as I have seen this city. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle for a period of time were calling for action across a pretty wide spectrum of programs, and still nothing really got done. After Las Vegas, we saw a call from, again, both Democrats and some Republicans on the bump stocks, which was something that the shooter there had used. We've seen no action on that. So continuing the momentum that these students have started is going to be a real challenge. The one place I would say where we have seen some action, and you could potentially see the prospect for more, would be at the state level. Places like New York and Connecticut, after some of these shootings, have taken action. That seems to be more realistic than some kind of national legislation in Washington.
Of course, the problem is, as we've seen in Chicago with the gang violence, you can have a tough law in a state and the guns still come in.
Absolutely.
Mark, I think a lot of people have been struck by the fact that President Trump, in all of his responses, has not once mentioned the word guns. As a candidate and as a private citizen, actually before that, he was strongly in favor of the assault weapons ban as a citizen of New York, but he became a very strong supporter of the NRA as a candidate and as president. And here he is talking to the group last April.
You came through for me, and I am going to come through for you.
Do you see the president supporting any new gun controls?
I think the question is going to be is what do we do to prevent and to secure the schools? And that's where the president's focused right now, on whether it's working with state and local officials on securing schools, mental health issues, and then also identifying those areas possibly where the ball was dropped from an investigatory and law enforcement standpoint to prevent a person with this kind of potential mental illness and these kinds of thoughts having the gun and being able to get it into the school.
All of those are clearly legitimate, but what about the argument that you heard from Mark Kelly that when you get a disturbed person like Nicholas Cruz, and yes, he should have been stopped long before, gets into a school not with a gun, not with a knife, but with an AR-15 with high-capacity magazines, it becomes the weapon of mass destruction?
I think, again, we're focusing on one specific gun, but as you showed earlier in the segment, you know, handguns commit far more crimes, or more people die with handguns. We've had mass shootings with handguns, not just the AR-15. So I think you've got to balance all of those very real issues, and I think that's why, you know, maybe there are loopholes that we can close. Maybe there are some things that we can do, and I think that's probably where the Congress is leaning right now. It's where the president's leaning in working with states on that.
Chuck.
Well, I think everything we're hearing, it's almost everything everyone says has some truth to it. you can't stop every single one. Mental health is important, but it's not the whole story. Handguns kill more, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, when you reduce it all out, what distinguishes this country from most other of its peers in the world is the easy availability of guns. And whether that's going to be dealt with at the state level, the way I was very interested to hear about this extreme emergency provision they have in some states that they don't have in Florida. There has to be something done at the margin to make it a little more difficult for a person with a lot of trouble to get a weapon like this. And so the politics of it at a certain point are going to have to catch up with the policy. But I have to say, I do agree with Julie. I don't see the politics being there yet. One of the most interesting things in the wake of this was the arguments coming out of a Democratic candidate in a special election in Western Pennsylvania, Trump country, where he was the one shying away from more gun control. In some parts of this country, this isn't even a Democratic-Republican issue. It's very regional. Rural populations will resist this, and we're going to be stuck where we've always been.
Michael, I want to pick up another aspect of this, because sometimes these shooters come out of nowhere. I never dreamt that he would do it, but there were warning sign after warning sign. More than 24 times local authorities were called with concerns about this kid, and then we've learned about these extraordinary failures by the FBI, including the one, as we mentioned at the top of the show, where somebody called the FBI tip line and identified Cruz as a threat. Here was the FBI response.
Under normal protocol, this information should have been provided to the Miami field office. Their appropriate investigative steps would have been taken. The FBI has determined that protocol was not followed.
Michael, how do you explain that? And should there be repercussions?
Well, there should be an investigation. We should find out what happened. And if protocols weren't followed, that should be followed up on. I mean, we should also keep in mind the men and women of the FBI are incredible. They're out there every single day keeping us safe. And I'm sure they're as devastated as anybody is about what happened. I think the question is, Chuck said that what differentiates America from the rest of the world is the easy access to handguns. That's not true. What actually differentiates America from the rest of the world is that we have a system of government which protects people and their rights from an oppressive government, from tyranny. And we shouldn't be as casual as some of this conversation is about taking away people's Second Amendment rights, their Fourth Amendment right to due process. And so even if we knew all of this, even if the red flags had been identified the way they should have been and those errors hadn't happened, what do you do next is the question. It's very easy in the light of tragedy to say it's very simple to take away people's rights, but we should be hesitant to do so.
So, knowing what you know about Nicholas Cruz, should he have been able to get a AR-15?
I think there's a long conversation about everything that should have happened. Obviously, nobody thinks that Nicholas Cruz should have had an AR-15. Obviously, tragedy could have been avoided. How you get from that statement, which 100% of Americans could agree with, to an actual public policy that achieves that while also respecting the rights of millions and millions of Americans is why this is such a difficult issue, and we shouldn't be casual about that.
All right, panel, we have to take a break here. We'll see you a little later. But when we come back, the one and only Rush Limbaugh is back live to discuss the other news, and there was a lot of it this week, including what's next for the Dreamers after the Senate rejects plans from both the left and right. Hiring with National Security Advisor says the new FBI indictments proved Russia interfered in the 2016 election.
As you can see with the FBI indictment, the evidence is now really incontrovertible.
Rush Limbaugh is back after the break to discuss that and more on Fox News Sunday. This has been another one of those weeks in the Trump era with major developments in a number of areas, from an immigration deadlock in the Senate to an explosive indictment in the Russia investigation. Rush Limbaugh is back with us again to discuss it all. And Rush, as I try to explain to your listeners, if I interrupt you, it's just to move you along so we can cover more territory. So let me start with...
I have given you the...
Go ahead.
I've given you the dispensation on that. They're very much aware of this, that might happen, and you're cool.
Okay, papal dispensation.
You're gold.
Let's start with the Russia investigation and the announcement of an indictment alleging a sophisticated Russian scheme to try to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. Here's what candidate Trump said about all of this during the campaign and what the Deputy Attorney General said on Friday.
It could be Russia, but it could also be China. It could also be lots of other people. It also could be somebody sitting on their bed that weighs 400 pounds, okay?
The defendants allegedly conducted what they called information warfare against the United States, with the stated goal of spreading distrust towards the candidates and the political system in general.
Now, I want to emphasize that there is no evidence, and the Deputy Attorney General made it clear, no evidence of any collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. But doesn't this indictment disprove what Mr. Trump has been saying all along, that any talk about the Russians is a hoax and that the special counsel investigation is a witch hunt?
I would be very careful if I were President Trump here. You know, this is just one of many different areas the special counsel is investigating. And without getting into details of this, because I think this is, everybody's trying to affect the outcome of elections, Chris, and everybody's poisoning the internet. Everybody's doing it, both parties, insane lunatic individuals. The Russians are pikers, actually, compared to Americans doing this. The problem is that it's illegal for them to do it. The danger for the president is it would be very, I think, seductive for him to embrace this, totally embrace, say, see, I've been vindicated. The worst thing he could do in his world is to validate this whole investigation by claiming victory here, because what if down the road there is another indictment or a series of indictments that do name Trump or do name the Russians and Trump campaign colluding? Because that's what this is about. This is about getting Trump, Chris. This whole thing is about setting Trump up for impeachment if the Democrats win in 2018. Donald Trump remains in the crosshairs. He is the target. And there is no let-up in that, no matter what this indictment does or doesn't say.
Let me pick up on that, because you say that the real scandal here is the effort by the Clinton campaign and the Obama administration to try to sabotage candidate Trump and now President Trump.
Oh, there's no question about it. And if you look at this indictment, I've had people say, does this mean that Hillary could be indicted or Fusion GPS? No, because this indictment doesn't charge anybody with collusion. It says they've defrauded the United States with mail fraud and wire fraud. You can't get the Fusion GPS or steal people. The real collusion, and there's no question about this, this is a paid political opposition research document that was made to look like legitimate intelligence. It perhaps was used to defraud the FISA court.
You're talking about the Steele dossier here.
Steele dossier. And pretty much everything that they've used. I mean, every story. I was on this program 1 year ago, and I told you that this whole thing, that Trump colluded with the Russians, was bogus, that there was never going to be any evidence for it. It did not happen. Every news story about it since then has included that, just like this indictment right here. No allegation in the indictment that any American was a knowing participant, nor is there any allegation the scheme affected the outcome of the election. Bingo.
But, Rush, let me ask you. I mean,
there isn't going to be.
The president's top foreign policy advisor in the campaign in the first couple of weeks of his White House, General Michael Flynn, has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. So has another campaign advisor, George Papadopoulos. Aren't you at least curious to find out what they have to say?
Well, in the Flynn, I'm glad you bring that up. In the Flynn episode, we have learned since that the people that conducted the interview with Flynn, Peter Strzok, did not believe he lied. A number of other people in the FBI did not believe Flynn lied. And yet, Flynn's under indictment, cops a plea for lying.
So
was Flynn told?
So wait a minute. Why do you think he pleaded guilty? I mean, it wasn't an indictment. He pleaded guilty.
Maybe he wasn't told. Well, because they had run him dry. His family was being destroyed. His financial net worth was destroyed. He was being broken. He had to stop the bleeding. But the question was, what was Flynn told by the FBI, by James Comey? Was Flynn told by the special counsel? By the way, the FBI does not believe you lied in their interview, in your interview with them. that seems to me to be crucial. And the new judge in this case, I think, is going to take that up. So I think this is all politics. And it's, Chris, it hasn't changed from the get-go. It is about protecting Hillary and Obama. Obama is the primary person being protected here because all of this spying and all of this collusion to destroy Trump happened with his knowledge and probably encouragement.
All right.
And the reason Hillary isn't charged is because that would mean Obama would have to be exposed as participating in the scheme, too.
All right. Let's move on to immigration. The Senate voted down 4 proposals this week, everything from the president's basic plan to a bipartisan plan. On your radio show, you recently said that you would be willing to grant citizenship to all of the Dreamers in return for full funding for the border wall. And at a certain point, after a lot of pressure, the Democrats seemed to agree to that, and the president demanded more. So what's going on here?
Well, this is actually take a lot to unpack. It's a political issue that the Democrats do not want solved. All this is an effort by the Democrat Party to provide for themselves a current underclass. They need a permanent underclass that is dependent on the government for their survival. That's why they want illegal immigrants granted citizenship. They don't want the issue solved. They don't want any issue solved, legislatively or otherwise, before the 2018 elections. And I think Trump is partially exposing that with the various different proposals that he's making. He's giving them pretty much what they want, and they're turning it down because they don't want it solved. I tell you what, I'll make you another deal right here. I would be willing right here to support an effort to grant permanent citizenship to whatever number of illegal immigrants there are in the country tomorrow. If you will make as part of the deal, they can't vote for 15 to 25 years. And if they will agree to that, then I'll grant them amnesty.
Well, that's pretty interesting. Let me turn to a couple of other.
Well, you see how many takers you get. You'll get 0 takers on that on the Democrats.
Well, unfortunately, you're not able. You're pretty powerful, but I'm not sure you can make that deal on behalf of Congress and the president. But it's a pretty interesting offer. Let me turn to the president. You say in year one that Donald Trump has had one of the most productive years, not first years, any years of any modern president. Explain.
Well, it's undeniable. I mean, you look at the economy just this first year, compare it to the 8 years of Obama, even the last 12 years, if you want to. We have not had this kind of economic revival in the economy. Wall Street's been going crazy for a long time, but in the economy, in the place where people work, the people who make the country work, their lives are changing dramatically, overwhelmingly, economically. Look at all the wage increases, the new jobs, the bonuses, and the expansion of benefits. The president is delivering on many of the things that he committed to and promised. And the Democrats demagogued and lied about this tax cut, telling everybody their taxes were going to go up. The Democrats now are beginning to regret. They can see the polling data. They can see that people are starting to really love this tax reform bill because they're finding out the Democrats lied to them about it. And there's not one Democrat fingerprint on it. There's not a single Democrat that can claim any credit for this massively booming United States economy.
But Rush, let me just pick up on one last thing, because he certainly deserves credit for a lot of things, but he failed to repeal Obamacare, he and the Congress. He has approved this new spending plan, which is going to add $500 billion to our national debt over the next 2 years. Does that disappoint you? Do you hear about it from any of your listeners?
You know, that is a fascinating question. In terms of this budget-busting spending, I haven't had one caller complain about it. I'm sure I will now, but I haven't had one. And it's been surprising to me that there hasn't been a single complaint compared to the spending complaining there was doing back in 2010 Tea Party was founded. But I think the massive size of these deficits is not going to be as large as predicted because of the tax cut. There's going to be revenue flowing into Washington they aren't counting. It's still going to be, I mean, it's deficit building, there's no question, but it's not going to be nearly as high and as bad as people think it is. What was the other thing you asked about?
You got about 45 seconds. Obamacare.
Well, we got rid of the individual mandate. That's been proposed. That's the guts of it. Formal repeal and replace, yeah, that hasn't happened. Maybe a mistake to do it first, not sure. But hey, this is just the second year. There's all kinds of time to come back and fix a bunch of things if you want. We're just getting, they are just getting started.
Rush, thank you. Thank you for joining us again today. Folks, again, when I interrupted, it was just to move along so you could hear Rush on more subjects.
It was fine.
Rush, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Come back.
It's anytime you want me, I'm here.
Up next, our Sunday group returns to discuss new charges in the special counsel's investigation, the indictment of 13 Russian nationals for trying to disrupt the 2016 election.
Tell a lie. Nobody does a President's Day sale like Smith Village Home Furnishings. Don't miss your chance to save on a...
No allegation in this indictment that any American was a knowing participant in this illegal activity. There is no allegation in the indictment that the charged conduct altered the outcome of the 2016 election.
Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein announcing the indictment of 13 Russian nationals in 3 companies by the special counsel, but taking pains to emphasize what is not being alleged. And we're back now with our panel. Chuck, what do you think the new indictment of the Russians shows? And what about the fact that here's another example where there's not a scintilla of evidence of collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign?
It's a fascinating document on many levels. On the legal level, of course, none of these Russians are ever going to be prosecuted. We can forget about that.
Because they're all in Russia and they won't be extradited.
Yes, but to your point about the collusion, clearly they were at pains to show there's no collusion in this part of the story. Left open still is the question about the Donald Trump meeting with the people allegedly peddling dirt on Hillary. That hasn't been resolved. So that could raise collusion in some form. And then, of course, the big open question is obstruction and whether there was anything in that regard. But what I see is Mueller sort of going piece by piece, and he has sort of finished off this piece, the Russian troll farm and propaganda. Between the lines of this indictment, especially since it's not going to lead to any prosecutions, I read it almost as Robert Mueller's statement, almost like a warning to the American people. See how evident it is to our adversaries that our internal divisions are getting to the point where they can be manipulated from the outside. And he was almost, I think, in the form of this indictment, issuing a wake-up call to the American people about the need for more national unity.
Michael, President Trump treated the indictment as a kind of vindication that all the allegations against him had been dismissed. Let's put up one of his tweets after the indictment. The Trump campaign did nothing wrong, no collusion. Is the president jumping the gun, claiming that he's been exonerated here? And are you struck, as a lot of people are, that, you know, even if he's off the hook, this indicates a real Russian interference in our election? The president's not talking about that.
Well, and I think that last point is where the focus should be. I mean, look, the president obviously feels there wasn't any collusion. There's been no evidence that collusion has come up. And the rest of the investigation will show whether or not that plays out. There's an interesting tidbit that the head of advertising of Facebook put out in the last couple of days. The Russians actually spent more money after the election than they did before the election. It goes to Chuck's point right now. There is a hostile foreign power that is trying to sow discontent in this country, that is trying to tear us apart. And all of us as Americans need to be aware of that and need to come together and to move on from this.
But the president isn't talking about that, and there are reports that he hasn't had a single National Security Council meeting, a single cabinet meeting about, forget his involvement or complete exoneration, about what everybody in the intelligence community says and law enforcement community says is a real threat, what they're going to do in 2018.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the president is extraordinarily frustrated that people are using this story and a story that so far has no evidence to try to discredit his presidency and his ability to get things done on behalf of the American people. That doesn't excuse the fact that all of us in all parts of government, all of us on the outside, need to care about our critical infrastructure. We need to care about election integrity, and we need to come together as Americans and make sure that we don't allow a hostile foreign power to tear us apart.
Let's turn to another big issue this week, and that's immigration and DACA and the failure of the Senate to pass any of the 4 proposals that were up there. President Trump says it's all up to the Democrats.
We think there's a good chance of getting DACA done if the Democrats are serious and they actually want to do it.
Mark, do you think the president and Republicans can sell that to voters, that if there is a failure on DACA and the Dreamers, it's the Democrats' fault? After all, it's the president who rolled back, who rescinded the DACA protections last fall.
Well, and many people, let's remember, too, that most people thought that that was an illegal program to begin with, so the court was likely to roll it back regardless.
Well, wait, but now we need to point out that there are two courts that say the president's rolling back of the program is illegal, and they've stopped it.
And that is likely to be taken up by the Supreme Court, and I have a feeling that the president's legal standing on that will be upheld by the Supreme Court. But here's the thing: once we get the Democrats got what they wanted. Supposedly they shut the government down for this. They got a pathway to citizenship. The president was very firm in saying, "I want money to secure the border, to build the wall, and to reform the immigration system." And yet they still can't get to yes on this. I know there's going to be an effort in the House to continue to move this discussion forward, and maybe because the deadline of March 5th right now is under a temporary hold because of the court action, once Congress faces a deadline, that's typically when they start moving again.
Julie, what do you hear from your sources at the White House? Have they given up on getting a deal with the Dreamers? Because whatever the House passes is going to be even more conservative than what was rejected by the Senate. And are there any second thoughts? Because, yes, the president made a huge concession in saying, I'm willing to give a path to citizenship for 1.8 million people, more than the Democrats we've been asking for. Democrats made a concession and said, we will fund the wall. Is there any second thoughts about walking away from that?
No, it's actually the opposite. I mean, the loudest and most influential voices in the White House right now on immigration are actually people who opposed that deal because they felt like it was too forward